The storm had ended only hours ago, but the forest still dripped and breathed like a living thing. Mist hung over the gravel road, soft and white, curling around the trees. My name's Daniel, and that morning I was driving the old ranger path near the lake to check for washouts. The rain had been relentless for 2 days straight, and half the hillside looked ready to slide into the valley. The air smelled like wet pine and clay. I rolled the window down, letting the hum of frogs and dripping branches fill the cab. Then I heard it, faint, high, broken. Not a bird, not the squeal of metal or the creak of wood. It sounded like a child crying. I killed the engine. The forest went still. Then it came again, a desperate, muffled sound, half whimper, half gasp. My gut twisted. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped into the mud. The ground sucked at my boots. The deeper I went, the quieter the forest became. Then, through the reeds, I saw something move, a small brown shape, struggling weakly in the middle of a slick, dark pool. I froze for a second, my mind trying to make sense of what I was seeing. A bear cub, alone, up to its neck in mud. Its eyes were wide, terrified, and the fur around its face was plastered flat with rain and dirt. The little paws clawed helplessly at the surface, each movement sinking it deeper. My first instinct was to back away. Where there's a cub, there's a mother, and no one survives getting between them. But this one was alone. Too alone. I scanned the tree line. Nothing but dripping branches. The cries came slower now, weaker. I didn't think anymore. I just moved. I went back to the truck for a rope and a thick branch I'd cut earlier. The mud was cold when I stepped in, a sucking, icy pull that made every step feel like walking through glue. I talked aloud, partly for the cub, partly for myself. Hang on, little one. Don't give up. Almost there. When I reached it, the cub's head barely stayed above the surface. It tried to lift a paw, then collapsed into the muck with a soft groan. My heart kicked hard against my ribs. I threw the branch toward it. It barely reached. I took one more step and felt the ground sag beneath me. The mud rose around my boots, biting tight. Another step, and I could feel it pulling at my knees. I looped the rope around my wrist and tossed the other end toward the cub. It didn't move. I cursed under my breath, then inched closer, dragging the rope through the sludge. The suction made awful sounds, wet and hollow. My foot slipped, and for a second the mud took me, cold up to the waist. Panic flashed white-hot in my chest. I clawed backward until I hit firmer ground. The cub made a faint cry. That was enough to keep me moving. I leaned forward, reached with the branch, hooked it around its small chest, and pulled. The branch bent dangerously, but the cub shifted an inch, then two. Mud bubbled around its sides. I hauled harder, the rope cutting into my hands. One last pull, and with a sickening slurp, it came free. We both fell backward into the wet grass. The cub lay motionless, gasping, its chest rising fast but shallow. I crawled closer, keeping my movements slow. Easy, I whispered. You're all right now. It didn't growl, didn't move, just blinked, mud dripping from its muzzle. I pulled off my jacket and wrapped it gently around the trembling body. The warmth of it soaked into my arms as I lifted the small creature, heavier than it looked, and carried it to the truck. Back at my cabin, I cleared space in the shed near the heater. I laid the cub down on an old blanket, cleaned the mud from its nose, and gave it a little water from a bowl. It drank weakly, eyes half closed, then curled into itself, the way frightened animals do when they've spent too long fighting to live. Night fell early, gray and silent. The forest outside was still dripping from the storm. I checked on the cub twice before bed, once at midnight, once near 2. The third time, I almost didn't believe what I saw. The door creaked open, and there it was, standing unsteadily near the threshold. The same brown eyes met mine through the dim light, the same look I'd seen out on the swamp. It didn't run. It just stood there, breathing softly, as if waiting for something I couldn't yet understand. By morning, the storm had passed for good. Sunlight pushed through the thin curtains in my kitchen, turning the steam from my coffee into a pale ghost above the mug. The world outside looked washed clean, every pine needle shining. Out in the shed, it was a different story. I heard the low rumble before I even opened the door. The cub was on its feet, pacing from wall to wall, claws clicking softly on the concrete. When it saw me, it didn't cower the way I half expected. Instead, it huffed, then trotted past me to the doorway and stared out toward the tree line. Easy, I said. You're not strong enough to go anywhere yet. It glanced back once, then made a sound that was somewhere between a whine and a growl. It wasn't angry. It was anxious. The kind of sound you hear when something is missing. Its mother. I stood there a moment, wrestling with common sense. Every ranger manual I'd ever read said the same thing. Don't interfere more than you have to. Don't treat wild animals like pets, and especially don't put yourself between a sow and her cub. But I'd already crossed a line by pulling it out of that swamp and bringing it here. If she was out there looking for him, I thought, I needed to know. All right, I muttered. One look. I grabbed my jacket, a small first aid kit, and the can of bear spray I kept by the door. I left the rifle on the rack. I knew too many men who reached for a gun first and a brain second. The cub waited at the edge of the yard, shifting from paw to paw, then moved toward the woods as soon as I stepped outside. We walked slowly at first. The ground was soft, our footsteps muffled in the damp earth. The forest felt different in daylight, bright and clear, but strangely quiet. No chainsaws, no distant highway noise. Just the drip of water from the branches and the occasional caw of a crow. The cub didn't wander. It moved in a straight line, nose low, like it knew exactly where it was going. Every now and then it glanced back at me, as if making sure I was still there. I kept a good distance, eyes sweeping the trees for any sign of a larger shadow. After a mile or so, we left the familiar trail and cut onto an old hunting path I hadn't used in years. It twisted between rocks and deadfall, barely more than a memory in the underbrush. The air grew colder as we climbed, little pockets of fog clinging to the hollows. That was when I saw the first sign, a muddy boot print. Fresh. I crouched, tracing the edges with my eyes. The tread was sharp, not yet softened by rain or time. Someone had been here within a day, maybe less. A little farther up the slope, something metallic caught the light. I picked it up with 2 fingers. A spent rifle casing. My stomach sank. Hunting season for bear had ended weeks ago. Whoever fired this shot hadn't been doing it legally. The cub moved ahead, nose working frantically now. A few yards later, the smell hit me, coppery and sour, heavy in the damp air. Blood. The clearing opened abruptly, a patch of torn earth beneath a broken spruce. The snow had melted here faster, stained dark and ugly. There were drag marks, deep gouges in the mud, clumps of dark fur caught on broken branches. In the center of it all, a wide print pressed into the ground, bigger, heavier than the cub's. A grown bear. The sow. The cub let out a sharp, keening cry and rushed to the spot, sniffing, pawing at the earth. It circled, whining, nose pressed into every mark. There was no body, no sign of where she'd been taken, just the ugly evidence of a struggle cut short. I swallowed hard, anger rising under my ribs. I'd seen poachers work before, always the same carelessness. Empty casings, torn up ground, no respect for anything living. I knelt and picked up another shell, then a third, slipping them into my pocket. Easy, I whispered, more to myself than to the cub. She might still be alive. It didn't answer, of course. It only kept searching, its small shoulders shaking with each rough breath. After a while, the sound of its crying faded into low grunts, then into exhausted silence. It finally slumped down beside the torn-up ground, pressing its body against the soil where its mother's scent still lingered. The sun had started its slow slide toward the ridge by the time I checked my watch. We were miles from the road, and the last place I wanted to be after dark was standing in the middle of a poacher's playground with a frightened bear cub. I touched its back lightly. "We have to go," I said. "I can't leave you out here." It looked up at me, eyes wet and glassy, then back at the clearing. For a second, I thought it would bolt deeper into the woods. Instead, it pushed itself to its feet and followed me, step by slow step, as we made our way down the trail. By the time we reached the truck, the sky had turned the color of bruised peaches, purple and orange, fading into blue. I lifted the cub into the bed, secured the gate, and climbed behind the wheel. The engine sounded too loud in the quiet valley. The road home wound between stands of fir and alder, the headlights cutting tunnels of light through the trees. My hands were tight on the steering wheel, the image of the blood-soaked clearing still burning behind my eyes. I kept thinking of the empty casing in my pocket, the illegal shot that had turned one family into a broken line of tracks. Halfway home, the hair on the back of my neck prickled. Something moved in the ditch to my right, a flash of brown, a ripple of muscle. I slowed, heart thudding, and squinted into the dark. Two pale discs hovered just above the brush line, catching the headlights. Eyes, wide, steady, unblinking. They didn't move as I rolled past. They just watched, not like a deer ready to bolt, but like something weighing me, judging whether I was threat or help. For a moment, I was sure I saw the outline of a larger bear's head behind the branches. Then the road curved, the angle broke, and the glow vanished into the trees, leaving only my own reflection in the windshield and the quiet, steady breathing of the cub in the back. 3 days passed before the rain returned. By then the cub had grown restless again. He'd eat, nap by the stove, then pace near the window, staring at the forest like something was calling him. I told myself he was just recovering. Animals remember where they come from. But every night, when the wind moved through the trees, he'd lift his head and listen so intently it made me uneasy. That morning I drove into town with the empty coffee can of spent casings in my passenger seat. The ranger office sat behind the diner, a squat building with peeling paint and a flag that barely stirred. I dropped the casings on the counter in front of Mark Jensen, the district officer. "Poachers," I said. "North Ridge, maybe 2 miles off the lake road." They took down a sow. He frowned, picking up one casing and rolling it between his fingers. "You see anyone?" "No, just this. And a cub she left behind." He looked up sharply. "You brought it home?" "Only for a few days. It would have drowned otherwise." Mark sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "You know the rule, Daniel. We're supposed to report rescues, not take them in. You want to explain that to a dying animal?" I asked quietly. He didn't answer. Instead, he slid the can aside. "We'll send a patrol to check the site, but without a carcass or trail, it's not much. Try not to get yourself in trouble playing saint of the forest." On my way out, I stopped by the diner for coffee. A few farmers sat in the corner booth, voices low but sharp. I didn't need to listen long to catch the tone. "Something got into Pete's calves again," one said. "Bear tracks all over the creek bank." Another grunted. "Figures. Soon as they start breeding near the ridge, we'll be knee-deep in them. Someone ought to thin him out before they start breaking fences again." I stirred my coffee and kept my head down. Same talk every year. Fear, anger, stories passed around until they felt like truth. It was easier to blame the bears than the drought, the coyotes, the open trash bins. People liked simple enemies. Back home, the cub greeted me with a grunt, then went back to watching the woods. He'd grown stronger, heavier, his fur filling out into a thick golden brown coat. I'd started calling him Buddy without meaning to. He didn't act like a pet, not exactly. He tolerated me, but his eyes were always somewhere else. That night, I woke to the sound of claws on wood. The shed door rattled once, twice. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside. The air was cold and wet, the fog clinging low. The cub stood by the open window, looking out. When I followed his gaze, I saw it, a set of prints in the soft ground just beyond the fence. Bigger than any I'd seen since the day we found the clearing. I knelt and ran my fingers along the edge of one. Fresh, maybe an hour old. The cub whined softly beside me, pressing close, nose twitching. My chest tightened. "She's alive," I whispered. I waited there a long time, listening for a sound that didn't come. No snapping branches, no heavy footfalls. Just the steady drip of water from the eaves and the cub's quiet breathing. When I finally went inside, he stayed by the door until dawn. The next morning, he was gone. I found the window pushed open wider, the blanket he'd slept on still warm. Outside, his small tracks crossed the yard and disappeared into the tree line. I followed them until they merged with a larger set heading west, deep into the woods. For a moment, I just stood there, hand on the rough bark of a pine, staring at the pattern of prints fading into the distance. The forest was silent except for the wind moving through the branches. Then, faint and low, it came, a rumble that rolled through the hills like thunder. A bear's call, deep, heavy, and unmistakably alive. The storm came without warning. One moment the forest was quiet, the next the sky cracked open, spilling rain so hard it sounded like gravel on the roof. I sat at the table, half dozing over a cup of coffee, when Buddy's old water bowl rattled across the floor. Then I heard it, a sharp bang from outside, followed by the frantic bawl of cattle from the neighboring pasture. I grabbed my flashlight and jacket. The air hit me like ice, rain slicing sideways. The wind bent the trees until their tops whipped like ropes. Lightning split the sky, lighting the yard in stark white. For a heartbeat I saw them. 2 men, running across the lower field toward the woods. One carried a rifle. "Hey!" I shouted, but the wind ate my voice. Another flash, and they were gone between the trees. Then came a sound that cut straight through the thunder. A roar so deep it felt like the ground itself growled back. The bear. I didn't think. I went back inside, pulled the old rifle from its case, checked the chamber, and slung the flashlight under my arm. Not to hunt, just to keep from being the next idiot they shot at. The rain turned the path to mud within minutes, my boots slipping on the incline as I followed the ridge trail down toward the creek. Every few steps, another flash showed the way, torn branches, boot prints, and streaks of mud where someone had fallen. The storm was swallowing sound, yet the forest was alive with motion. Then I heard a scream, high and short, not from an animal. Human. It came from near the creek bed. I ran. The flashlight beam caught a shape tumbling down the slope ahead. One of the men, sliding helplessly in the mud before crashing into the water below. His rifle clattered somewhere out of sight. The other man yelled his name, voice panicked, then turned and disappeared into the trees. When I reached the edge, I stopped cold. Across the creek stood the sow. She was massive, soaked to the skin, her fur slicked black under the rain. Blood streaked her shoulder where a bullet had grazed. Her head swung toward the man in the water, who was struggling to his knees. Between them, half hidden by the roots of a fallen tree, stood the cub, smaller now against her bulk, but unmistakably the same one I'd rescued. The mother planted herself between the man and her child, a wall of muscle and rage. She roared again, the sound echoing through the valley like thunder finding a voice. The man screamed, scrambling backward, hands up. The rifleless fool tripped over a rock and vanished into the brush on the far side. The one in the creek pulled himself up and stumbled away, limping hard. I raised the light higher, its beam shaking with my breath. "Easy, girl," I said softly, though she couldn't hear me over the storm. "You're all right now. They're gone." Her head turned toward me. For a moment I thought she'd charge. Instead, she stood still, chest heaving, eyes locked on mine. There was pain there, but also something else, awareness. The same look I'd seen once before in the swamp. The cub let out a low cry. The mother turned, nudging it gently toward the trees. The cub hesitated, glancing back at me before following her up the slope. The rain made everything slick, and halfway up she stumbled, catching herself with a paw. Without thinking, I stepped closer and swung the flashlight toward the path, lighting the rocks ahead of her. She froze, then looked over her shoulder at me one last time. For a heartbeat, neither of us moved. The storm dimmed to a dull roar, the rain softening. Her eyes held mine, calm now, not wild, not afraid, just steady. Then she turned and climbed out of sight, the cub padding after her. The forest swallowed them both. I stood there until the thunder rolled off into the distance. The only sound left the creek rushing past my boots. My clothes were soaked through, my hands shaking around the flashlight. Somewhere beyond the ridge, a car engine sputtered, the poachers running for their lives. But I didn't care about them anymore. For the first time in weeks, the forest felt whole again. Whatever lines we'd all crossed out here, man, animal, or otherwise, they had been redrawn by that look in her eyes. A look that said she remembered. Weeks passed before the forest felt calm again. The river dropped, grass returned, and life in town went on. Though for me, everything still felt one step behind. Then the news came. 2 poachers arrested, caught with evidence from the hills. Mark called soon after. "Those casings you found matched a rifle," he said. "You did good, Daniel." I thanked him, but all I could picture was the mother bear's eyes through the rain. The days grew quieter. I fixed fences, stacked wood, tried to forget, but each time I passed the shed, I remembered the cub curled in that corner. At night, I sometimes thought I heard a soft huff outside, though the yard was empty. One morning I woke certain I had to return to the swamp. I packed a thermos, started the old truck, and followed the same dirt road as before. The forest was green again, alive but hushed. When I stepped from the truck, the air was cool and still, the mud cracked and firm. I reached the same spot where I'd pulled the cub from the muck. It looked harmless now. I was about to turn back when a branch snapped nearby. Across the clearing stood 2 shapes, the the mother and her growing cub. Her coat shone, the old wound gone. They stood at ease, calm and silent by the water. I didn't move. The cub lifted his head first, then her gaze found mine. There was no fear, no threat, only recognition. For a moment, the world shrank to that line of sight between us. Then she turned, nudged her cub, and they walked into the forest without a sound. I let out a long breath and stayed until even the rustle of branches faded. People like to believe wild animals live apart from us. But out there I understood. They see us, they learn, and sometimes they trust us long enough to survive. They never ask for help, never thank us, they just keep moving. And every so often, if we're lucky, they let us stand close enough to prove we're worth that trust.